Before we start the discussion, I just wanted to share a personal experience I had last week. I was in Germany emptying my late parents' house, and I kept getting ads for a hearing aid. And I couldn't quite figure out why it was, because I was logging onto my computer. I never get these ads back at home, but I think it really proved the point Shoshana has been making. Data is just extracted from us everywhere. And unless we do something about it, and not we as individuals do something about it, the big corporations are going to continue with that practice. So I'd like to have a proper look first at the threats democracy and the rule of law are facing at the moment, before we go to remedies and solutions. Shoshana has already mentioned that the EU is quite active on this, so it's worthwhile to have a closer look. I'd like to start with Katarina Barley, Vice President of the European Parliament, also a former Minister of Justice. How big do you think, from your personal experience, how big a threat is technology really for democracy at this point in time?
Well, thank you very much for the invitation first, and for the honor to be with all these interesting women and having an all-female panel on this. I mean, this is really something unusual concerning this topic also. I think indeed there is a huge danger for democracy. And Shoshana has touched upon a lot of issues, but there is still more to mention. I would just like to say the deep fakes, for example, that we are seeing. We have manipulated videos where you really believe that Angela Merkel is resigning, for example, or that, I don't know, whatever you want to imagine. So you can actually cause an outrage by something where you in the past thought this has to be real. It is, I mean, you see someone saying it, so how can you doubt it? So we have all these different aspects. We have these big tech companies gathering all sorts of data. We have misinformation. We have these technical manipulations. So we are in danger because people, few people know very much about everyone and are able to manipulate. And the people who are willing to inform themselves are not able, or will be able less and less, to inform themselves in a way that they can rely on something. So I think there are threats from, and these are just two sides of the medal. I'm sure there are more, even more threats to democracy. So yes, I think we have a lot of issues that we have to deal with.
Thank you very much. Sasha, you are the founding CEO of a think tank that looks at all these dangers, but also at the interlinkages. You don't look at isolated points, but you have a pretty good overview. I think this leads directly to the question, did you see the storm on the Capitol? Did you see this coming? Was this apparent in the data you're analyzing and your colleagues, you're looking at it day to day?
Thank you so much, Silke, and it's wonderful to be here with you. I mean, the short answer is yes. If there were ever a more visible, jarring and extraordinary challenge to a mature democratic process, I can't think of one in recent history. It was shocking, but for those of us studying the online information ecosystem, it wasn't a surprise. And that wasn't just because of the extraordinary and heightened levels of weaponized hate, of conspiracy, of extremism, of disinformation that we monitored across the open and closed parts of the web over the past year, including one of the longer standing and most, I suppose, successful disinformation, voter fraud disinformation campaigns that we've seen in an electoral context. But it's also because of the longer transformation, if you like, in the organizational dynamics, in the communications tactics of an array of bad actors that we've watched really over the last decade go essentially unchallenged. And so it wasn't a surprise. And the question I think that we need to be asking ourselves is how quickly do we need to solve this before this becomes a systemic, perhaps an existential challenge for us here in Europe. Of course, we have policies afoot that I think are encouraging. But I think the thing that I took away from this was I suppose the interconnection of three things. As I mentioned, this sort of transformation, the coalescence of and aligning at a sort of unprecedented level of a whole array of bad actors, combined with a kind of hypercharging, a result of the, if you like, the technological architecture of the platforms Shoshana's talked about, that massive amplification, if you like, of content that comes closest to the red line of extreme messaging, and ultimately a kind of information ecosystem segregation that we've seen happen over the last 5 years in particular. And that's reflected both on and offline.
Thank you very much. I'm going to ask you, how quickly do we need to act? You asked the question. Do you have an answer to that?
I think Shoshana said just at the end, how everything is speeding up. We have to act extremely quickly because where I think there have been doubts, certainly, in our research, for instance, of extremism and terrorism, let's say 5-6 years ago, it was hard actually to convince many policymakers that there was, in fact, a correlation between online activity and offline real world action. I think that penny now has dropped when we see the scale of the impact, let's say, of COVID disinformation and anti-vax disinformation. If we see the very real impact that electoral disinformation has had in this recent election, I think that penny has dropped. So what we do know is that self-regulatory attempts to date, be they in a European context and an international context, have fallen short. And
I think that penny has dropped, because
otherwise,
I think
that penny has also dropped fundamentally within certain contexts, but perhaps not in all. And I think we're yet to see what happens with the new administration in the United States. I think there is optimism that there will be an openness for transatlantic engagement around this policy and regulatory space in a way that perhaps wasn't there before. But time is of the essence, there is no question.
Thank you very much. Shoshana, one thing we've seen on Capitol Hill is even if you act, there is a consequence. Some of the networks were closed down, and then you realize police find it far more difficult actually to trace those activities because people go to the darknet. So is this a race that could ever be won?
Well, look, I think the one word that's missing so far from this conversation is the word economics, because everything that we're talking about, all of the harms that we're talking about, and they are harms that are destructive to democracy and to the very fabric of society. But these harms are being produced by an economic logic. It's not the way technology works, or it's not the way algorithms work. It's that when you walk onto a Facebook platform, or when you walk into a Google platform or an Amazon platform, you're not walking into some open space, like you're standing on the beach looking out the ocean and the beautiful horizon. It's the opposite of that. It's like, imagine you're walking into a rainforest. If you've ever seen a rainforest, you know how scary that is. I mean, because it's so dense and everything is alive and pulsating, and it's almost impossible to make your way through. Picture yourself with a machete chopping your way through. But what you're walking through are economic imperatives, and you're walking through the mechanisms and methods, the algorithms, the whole range of targeting mechanisms that are algorithmically programmed. And so there is no free space. You are walking through a private space that is completely institutionalized by private surveillance capital. And you are hacking your way through the density of its imperatives. So one of the key things to know about this space is that it is indifferent to truth. It's the main operation that drives the economics is extraction, the extraction of human-generated data, which is then claimed as proprietary, as the private property of the companies doing the extraction, the Facebooks, the Googles, et cetera, et cetera. And behind this abstraction is the imperative for scale. None of the targeting works. You can't get the algorithms to do the things you want to do. You can't create the deep fakes or the algorithmic amplification that Sasha's organization has brought to the public awareness with such tremendous focus and insight and competence. You can't do any of that without data at scale. So part of what that means is the machines are taking in every kind of data they can, but they are formally indifferent to the meaning of the data. They're formally indifferent to its truth value. All data are regarded as equivalent, even though they are not equal. So, and in fact, there's a great line from Eric Schmidt, 2017. I don't know if you remember this, but he was being confronted in 2017, kind of in that period after the 2016 elections, but before Cambridge Analytica. And he was being confronted by journalists about how their algorithms work and are doing some of these pernicious things that Sasha and her team has written about. And so he's sort of defending the algorithm, and he says, you know, when it comes to algorithms and the search engine, quote, there is a line that we really cannot get across. It is very difficult for us to understand truth. So just think about this for a minute. You know, here is essentially a $1 trillion market cap corporation, the largest data company arguably ever existing on planet Earth. Its stated mission is to organize and make accessible the world's information, and it cannot, not that it will not, it cannot tell the difference between a truth and a lie. And this failing, not only does it not impede Google's success, but it is actually essential for Google's success. So this is the world that we're living in, and it's an economic world. So the interventions have to be lawful interventions. We need the laws to intervene on this. We need the charters of rights to protect us from this. And then I think we can make a lot of change pretty quickly. And those deep fakes become things that we can outlaw, and we can crank up the engineering to be able to find them and discern them, and make sure that they're not published. And that's getting harder and harder, and it is an arms race. But right now, democracy is not in the race, and that's where we have to be.
Thank you very much. I mean, you've been very optimistic about what Europe is trying to do earlier on. You were saying this is the right way to go. Katarina, Barley, Commissioner Breton, after the storm on Capitol Hill, was saying this couldn't have happened if the Digital Services Act were already in place. Do you agree? And how will it work? I mean, you're currently working on it at the European Parliament. How could it actually prevent a repetition of this in Europe?
Well, the Digital Services Act is supposed to hold the big tech giants more liable than they are at the moment for their content. And but at the same time, if I refer to what Shoshana just said, at the same time, actually does not form an obligation for the tech companies to delete content. It's very much about transparency. It's about knowing who, for example, has put money on some news or advertisement or whatever you are seeing. It's about making the audience more capable to understand what is happening and to take it into account. But we, at least in Europe, and I think in the US it might be even worse, we have very much this discussion about trying to protect individuals and censorship. I mean, we've had that, Germany is at the forefront. I think even within Europe, we've had domestic national laws that are going further than what we see in most other European countries when it concerns hate speech, for example, or criminal offenses in the internet, on the social platforms. And I mean, this political discussion was huge. We've had demonstrations in the streets with thousands and thousands of people telling us not to censor positions and personal views. And I think this is, politically speaking, as a political actor, this is the difficulty that we are facing. Because of course there are positions where you can distinguish very well between a lie and truth. But there are very many positions where it's kind of, I mean, nobody really knows. Taking this vaccination thing, for example. I mean, usually vaccinations do have side effects. Yes, they do. Almost every vaccination does. And take the measles, for example. They have very severe side effects, but very rarely. So 1 in 3 million really has, just roughly, I'm not a medical expert, has a very severe complication. So, and others have lighter ones. And now if you talk about a vaccination being safe or not, can you say this vaccination threatens your health? If you have 1 in 3 million, 1 in 500,000, 1 in 2,000 who have severe side effects, this is something where it is very difficult to say yes or no. And this is for us who are trying to regulate the challenge number one, I would say. And the one question that lies behind it is also, who is the one to judge? Because I am from a generation where we fought against the state being the one to capture your data. I mean, we had this I think it was in 84 or something like that. We had a judgment by our constitutional court when it came to a public collection of data of everyone. Everyone was handed out still on paper, a sheet where you had to fill in who you are, how many, not who you are, and anonymously, how many children you have, etc., just to have the data. You do that every I don't know, decade as a state. And there was a huge outrage, and we had a successful lawsuit against this, because people thought you as a state were not supposed to get into this, to have personal data, too much personal data of your citizens, which I agree upon still. Now we are at a point where young people, net activists, addressed me when I was still a minister in charge, saying, actually the state, you should set up a public Google. You should set up a public Facebook, because the only way that we can get these interests, these economic interests out of that, and still have the freedom of the internet is to have it in the hands of the state. And I was like, what? I mean, is that really the solution? And these were experts. I mean, these were very, very bright people who proposed that. And but I'm really very curious. I have these two very interesting scientists with me on the panel. For me, this is the key conflict that we have. Are we as public, as policymakers, are we the ones to, in the end, define how to judge between truth and lies? Are we the one to give this competence to someone else? This is also in the discussion, to give it to civil society, for example. The legitimacy to judge upon this, that is we can't just have Twitter delete accounts like that. I think we all agree on this. We have to have rules for that. But that is really, and we can't have the courts, because I used to be a judge myself. We have, I don't know how many thousand judges in Germany. You can't have them control the internet. This is absolutely impossible. So this is the question that I think is one of the keys.
One of your fellow MEPs made the point after Trump was silenced by Twitter. How about Twitter starting to silence commissioners who come up with unpleasant proposals? So very fair point. I'm going to pass it on to the other two panelists. Sasha, who should be the referee?
It's a really interesting conversation, and the point that you've raised about the kind of trade-off between free speech and censorship at the heart of this debate is an important one, but I think it's largely misrepresented, and I think that in part the companies have gotten behind that misrepresentation because it serves their ends quite well. What we actually see is the distortion of the information ecosystem by these platforms. This isn't actually a free speech environment. It's a distortive environment of speech. You talked about, Shoshana talked a little bit about, in a way, the agnostic dynamics of the platforms. They are indeed agnostic to content, but they're not content neutral. So I just give you a couple of bits of data from others in our research, starting with Facebook's own research, which was leaked a couple of years ago from 2016, that found that 64% of all extremist group joins are due to their own recommendations algorithm. Our own research on Holocaust denial content showed that content was still being recommended to users. It wasn't that we had to go searching, but it came to us, if you like. The disproportionate breakthrough that we've seen now and engagement rates with disinformation, number one, in relation to COVID. So we did an analysis of disinformation, COVID disinformation versus the reach and engagement rates around, let's say, the WHO's website, their information. The WHO's content was reaching on Facebook and engaging with some 6 million people. The disinformation that we were tracking was reaching in the order of 80 plus million people and engaging with that number. Similarly, just now with this vote fraud disinformation, and that the alleged voter fraud content, we saw that content reaching double the amount, engaging with double the amount of people on Facebook than the sort of best performing content that was denying such allegations. So you see a sort of systems problem here. And where I think we need to head is beyond content approaches to policy and regulation. We need to get to the systems approach. And I think this is where the DSA actually takes extraordinary steps forward. Transparency is absolutely critical, but that transparency has to be regulated, it has to be computational. And we believe it needs to be a transparency that's regulated across not just the algorithmic dynamics that we've just talked about, but the policies, the processes, the outcomes. We need to have visibility of those processes, those policies and those outcomes in relation to these very important things that the companies do, in relation to content moderation and redress, in relation to advertising, and in relation to those systems and architecture, the algorithmic piece. There are examples from other sectors, the financial services sector, around algorithmic audit that I think give us a sense of how this can be done. It is something that is doable, but we need now to move towards that systems-based approach, because it deals with your question, Silke. Who gets to decide what's true and false? Nobody. What we should be deciding on is access to the data that gives us an understanding of how the information ecosystem is being distorted and what the public health, safety, security outcomes of that distortion are. On the basis of that data, on the basis of that transparency, then we can start to make decisions in full view of that information, which, by the way, nobody has today. Nobody has that access, neither governments nor indeed civil society nor researchers. Nobody has that access. Then we can start to make informed decisions within liberal democracies where we debate how we address those societal outcomes of the design of the architecture of these platforms.
If I understand that correctly, you need a lot of transparency to make it of a good decision and to have a full picture of what's going.
And you need an audience that wants to be informed. I think this is also part of the problem. May I, Silke, may I just add a question to the other two panelists? Because quite already, I don't know, 3 years ago, I asked for something and I was criticized very heavily for it, but I still think it is true. If we install something that that ensures plurality, kind of a plurality obligation to oblige the companies to design their algorithms in a way that you do not, well, you will certainly in one way or the other stay in a sort of a bubble, but that these algorithms that are now designed to show you what you want to hear, to have an obligation for a rupture of this. Like, I don't know how, there are different ways of doing it. I mean, you can either have an obligation to pour in WHO flagged serious, I'm lacking the word, information, or you could have an obligation to show the opposite. When I had of course a lot of conversations with responsibles of these tech companies, and Facebook, I remember they told me that they, when I brought this up, they said that they already included this in a very moderate way, of course, by shifting the impact of what you have liked previously. This, of course, is part of the algorithms, more to who you like, who your friends are, because this is much more diverse. You have your weird uncle and you have your neighbor who might have completely different opinions than you have in these friends. So shifting it from content to your personal environment already creates sort of more plurality. But do you think that this plurality aspect also is something, of course, not alone, but combined with transparency and information, that would help?
Shoshana, what's your take on that? And also the question of the referee, because it is very important.
Well, you know, the free speech debate, I think, has been a way that democracy has sort of shot itself in the foot for many years now, because of a lack of understanding of what is really going on behind the scenes. And Sasha was certainly touching on this in her remarks. We're not talking about, you know, the idea of free speech. If we go back to what was the original idea? The idea was that each citizen has the opportunity to speak their mind. They cannot be unilaterally without reason, censored or silenced by their government. and that the concept, certainly in the American Bill of Rights, the concept is very much a concept of imagining a free and open public space, a public square. Habermas called it the public sphere, and the idea that in an open public sphere, ideas will rise and fall ultimately based on their merit. And therefore, in this public square of free speech is consistent with a viable society, because a viable society needs a normal distribution. It needs norms that are at the center, and most people in the society, the great majority of people in the society, understand and agree to and adhere to those norms. And so they dominate the center. There are differences of opinion on many things, but where those differences become fringe, where they become real deviations from the norms, they naturally, in a public square, will congregate around the margins, not at the center. This is the only way that society, any society, can exist. Without that, I mean, imagine something as simple as traffic. Every time you're driving your car, you get to an intersection and there's a red light. You don't have to get out of your car, pull your gun or your knife, and go into the intersection and start fighting everyone else for who gets to come and go. You don't even have to get out and start shouting. In an orderly society, which we mostly have, everybody agrees that red means stop and green means go. And there aren't enough police in the world to enforce this at every single traffic light. This is how we have society. I think of it like auto racing. Some people love auto racing, like NASCAR racing. You go to a track and you watch cars going insanely fast. and some people love that, and they think it's art, it's skill, it's amazing. Speed has its own kind of beauty. But does anybody want NASCAR racing in the neighborhood? No. In the neighborhood, you want your red lights and you want everybody to go, in an orderly way that we all agree to. Well, what Sasha is describing and what the research of her institute has shown in many different cases is that what is specifically happening in a place like Facebook, for example, is that the NASCAR racing is being artificially, this is not natural selection, it's unnatural selection, it's being artificially driven to the neighborhood, to the center. What should be at the margins is being driven to the center. And it makes the center unlivable. It makes the center chaos. Why is that happening? It's happening again. If you remember one thing from what I've said today, it's happening because of economics, because crazy stuff draws more engagement. Engagement is not the end game. The end game is extraction. The more engagement, the more time, opportunity, what information scientists call attack surface, the more attack surface there is for us to draw out the behavioral data that becomes our private property that we use for all of our downstream processes of commercialization. Okay, so we are at the mercy, we're not in a public sphere, we're in a private sphere, we're in a private square, owned and operated by surveillance capital. That's where we are today. There is no free speech in this private square. It's what Facebook wants to vault to the center for the sake of its own revenue streams. That's where we live today. So if we don't act on this as Democrats and understand, Democrats small d, of course, and understand that the only way we will ever have free speech again is to interrupt and outlaw these mechanisms of private capital in order to reclaim that beach looking out at the ocean and the horizon that I was talking about, you know, some relatively free space where once again, truth more or less rises to the top, good ideas more or less rise to the top, and the pernicious, the hateful, the downright organized disinformation campaigns of deceit that are intended to unravel the social fabric, those naturally fall to the fringe where they belong. And it's not that we don't treat them, we deal with them. We have laws and sanctions and we deal with them, but we deal with them at the fringe. They're not on Capitol Hill fueling a political coup. So this is where we are right now, and we need our lawmakers to understand this. Perhaps just the last thing I'll say is it's not a question of, you know, now we have censorship by the private market, and so let's switch to censorship by the state. It's a question of the state, which is to say the democratic state. I'm not talking about Duterte, for example. You know, I'm not talking about the autocratic state. I'm talking about democracies. It's essential for democracies to use law and to use new rights to clear the space, to give us back a free space where we don't have to have censorship, where we have that natural play, the natural selection of the best ideas and the best information, not those, what was it, the 34 websites that got multiples of Facebook visits, whereas no one was going to get the good information from the WHO and the CDC. That would not happen if we had democratic laws outlining the imperatives and the algorithmics that derive from them, clearing the space so that once again, the good information rises and the corrupt information falls.
Sasha, we got a very interesting question from my colleague Malte Fischer. He's asking, would it make a difference if we established a law giving us the ownership of our data? Would that make a big change? I mean, would it change things? No.
I think that the fundamental issue here is having regulated oversight, democratic oversight of the processes that we've just talked about. It ultimately comes down to that, which isn't so different from, of course, what we do in relation to other industries. And so shouldn't be such a stretch of the imagination. What we've really seen in the recent period is a sort of fringe insurgency, exactly what Shoshana said. We've called it the fringe insurgency. We've seen those groups and ideas and movements that ultimately people believed to be small-scale fringe grouplets mainstream themselves, normalize themselves successfully with a systemic impact on our democratic civic culture. This question of organic versus inorganic, that has to be applied to this dichotomy that's often presented around speech and censorship. Speech, I think, is only really to be called speech if it is, in fact, organic. If it is inorganically amplified and targeted, that's not really what we mean by it. And ultimately, we need a regulatory system that levels the playing field again for speech, where good can outcompete bad ideas. Just as Shoshana said, we set about trying to do just that at the outset with our work on extremism and indeed terrorist content, sort of interestingly mobilizing civil society in this space to outcompete bad with good. And what we realized quite quickly is that the cards were stacked against us, that it was never going to quite work. And it was for these reasons. Number one, that bad actors deploy bad behaviors online, your bots and they game the system, fakery of all kinds. And secondly, that the system itself tilts in the interest of extreme messaging. Mainstreamed extremism is a systemic threat to democracy long term. We have to know it. This is not the public square, it's the private square that we're talking about, but we need a public square. In the German elections in 2017, we found that by and large, voters voting for mainstream parties were still imbibing mainstream media. And those that were voting AfD were almost exclusively imbibing their information from an alternative media ecosystem largely online. That information segregation and fragmentation that we're seeing is undermining the public square. It has a huge set of implications. So for me, it's not about necessarily your data ownership, although I like the idea of having absolutely a system that gives you back more control over how your data is utilized. But that system needs to be one of transparency, as I've said, across the policies, processes, and outcomes of these platforms.
Thank you very much. We're running out of time, so I'm asking that the two panelists I'm going to address now to be extremely brief. Katarina, Barley, how soon do you think will we have a DSA and a DMA that are sort of approved by all the relevant actors in Brussels? And then Shoshana, will that be quick enough? Literally just giving me a date and then a quick response.
Well, if we see that GDPR, which was a big step, I think it took 6 years. I believe it will be shorter than that, but we have just started the discussion with the Commission, so it will take a couple of years, I would say.
Shoshana, is that quick enough? You were so optimistic about Europe.
Is it quick enough? Look, I think if, we're also seeing in France and in Germany, a discussion about pre-implementation of some of the critical pieces, the DMA in Germany, the DSA in France. I think that will go a long way toward accelerating this process and signaling to the companies, to our citizens and to the world that these changes are really going to occur. And I think, a year or two for deliberation and actually making sure that we fund these new pieces of legislation, not only with ample financial resources, but with the scientific resources and the human resources that we're going to need from all the participating countries for these auditing operations that are going to be so critical, and for the new public authorities that are going to be vested, that are going to be so critical. I think a couple of years is reasonable. The third decade, we're in the third decade. This is essential. If we limp to the end of this decade without decisive action, finding our way back is going to be more difficult, much more difficult, more violent, more fraught, and far more unequal playing field. So time is of the essence, but it's also democracy, and we love democracy.
Yes, indeed. Time is of the essence. And also I see Christine is already waiting for us to wrap up. I'd like to thank all my lovely panelists. I think this was my first ever all-female panel. I'd like to thank you all for your insightful contributions. I think this is a discussion that we should follow up on soon, because it's just extremely relevant and it cannot be stressed enough. Christine, over to you.